And it did affect my view of them. I did read their books differently. Because if, let's say I'm reading some book and it's talking about love of neighbor and how important that is and hospitality and that we need to practice intellectual hospitality, and I've seen them act like a total buffoon on Twitter, yes, I mean, I can't, the jury will disregard that remark. Well, I can't just erase it from my brain. And so it does affect their credibility in my mind.
Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Cameron, today, this is going to take a little bit to set this topic up, so surprise, surprise. But I'd like to pull two stories together because it's something that's sort of been flittering around in the back of my mind. And I'll start with Greta Thunberg and the Israeli education system. So how's that for a starter? So the issue at hand is, Greta Thunberg, some of you will know, Swedish, kind of several years ago became famous as like the climate activist supreme as a child. And she was seen holding a sign that said, "Stand with Gaza." So Israel's Department of Education said, look, we're no longer using references to Greta Thunberg in our educational curriculum on climate change and environmental science, because if she is willing to take a stand on something without doing any research or really understanding the complexity of it, clearly she's not a very thoughtful person. And therefore, and of course, this is the nation of Israel responding at a horrific moment in their history. So you can see tensions are high here. But what they're saying is that if she can't get something in their minds that's simple right, like the Israel-Palestinian conflict, then it's hard to take her seriously in the other categories of life in which she's a spokeswoman for different movements. So you can kind of see that train of thought there of like, look, if you're not doing your due diligence and researching in one category, that makes us second guess your ability to think well or represent well something in another category. Basically, you're making yourself look bad and you're talking about something that you don't understand. And so from the environmental climate science side of this, they're saying, this is not a good look for the movement that we have. Okay, so hold that in the back of your mind. So that's going on. At the same time, some of you will have listened maybe to the Russell Moore Show, his most recent podcast with Tobias Kramer on Christianity being co-opted. And in that podcast, they're looking at the history of how Christianity is used in political senses in nations, and not just America. In fact, America is a little bit unique in this, but broadly speaking, a lot of quote Christian nationalism is arising from people who actually don't go to church. Now, that won't surprise most of you listening to this, where you have people who are using Christianity as a national identity, sort of like the faith of our fathers and the way things used to be, though we ourselves no longer go to church, are using that identity. And even the polling data would suggest that if you look at a character like Donald Trump, that in the initial primary, that it was the non-church attending, culturally Christian or historically Christian, or saw that as some part of America's past, who were responsible for Trump's rise in the primaries. But then once he became the candidate, what's unique is that in America, the rest of church-going evangelicals jumped on board there. So what's fascinating as you spool all of that out is that they were saying you have here a political movement that's using the name Christianity as a tool to pursue a certain agenda that isn't based off of Christian concepts. It's just kind of another weapon in the arsenal. And there are times in which I think you look at different countries across the world and you can see that Christians sort of get played like a fiddle as being kind of useful tools and getting people elected and not getting a lot out of that. Even when you look at Germany and the whole thing with the Jews, there's lots of information out there saying that was just starting with Jews and they were going to whack the Christians next as a Jewish sect, but they needed the Christians to support them. They needed a Christian national identity, even if the confessing Christians weren't part of it, in order to get, so they're kind of using one group against another group that they were also later going to try to get rid of. So all of that to say, and let me try to bring these together and then get you to comment on it, is that sometimes the way in which you get identified with something has a massive implication for how seriously people take you in another category. That's not shocking. That's not a newsflash to anybody, but it does have some significance in our time for us to think about as Christians about how what we get associated with as Christians either lends credibility to our faith and our Christian beliefs or seriously detracts from how people think of us as thoughtful engagers with reality. So help me summarize what I just said there, maybe make it more palatable, and give us your first thoughts of how you see that all working together.
Well, it strikes me that this is a time where it's uniquely, well, there's a unique liability today to have your credibility threatened because of the immense pressure on the one hand to publish your opinions about every conceivable subject for the world. So one analogy, think about whenever an actor you like starts pontificating about politics. This happens more and more now than it used to. But it used to be an occasion for a lot of ire. People would get really annoyed and they would say, just don't quit your day job, stick to acting. You do the same thought experiment with athletes and other celebrities.
Right.
But this is of course a cultural moment where people can really sound off on anything and everything all the time. And so you'll have people who are respected in a certain category. Let's pick on Professor Richard Dawkins now. He's another celebrated public intellectual, but his area of expertise, he's a scientist. So his area of expertise is really rather narrowly focused on biology. And I know that there are certain times where it's just inevitable we're going to speak off the cuff because we have opinions and we want to give our opinions. But it's one thing to speak off the cuff. I think context here is, so I'll hope to make sense of all of this in a second here, Nathan. I hope this is sounding a bit convoluted. Context is king here. It's one thing if you're in your living room or you're having a beer with a group of friends or a coffee or a tea, pick your vice, and you're talking about what's going on in the world. And but it's very different if you're a person with some level of celebrity, some level of recognition, and you sound off for the benefit of millions on social media or some other place on a topic that falls well outside your expertise, and you also give the impression that you're pretty ignorant of it as well. That carries some serious consequences. So what I'm trying to honor here, Nathan, is on the one hand, all of us speak off the cuff sometimes, and you don't need to be an expert on every field to have an opinion on it. But on the other hand, if you're a person with some level of celebrity or notoriety, there comes with that a certain responsibility. And also, you just need to brace for impact if you start shooting your mouth off on something that you don't understand. So it just strikes me that that's a unique liability. But in a sense, I'm talking about celebrities here, but this affects all of us. Most of us aren't celebrities.
That's what I was just getting ready to say.
Yes.
There's a neighborhood version of this.
There's a neighborhood version of this, but we all have access. We all have bigger megaphones than people have had in the past. And we can reach huge numbers of people, even if we're not celebrities. You don't have to be a celebrity to have a major audience. And so there's a good word of warning in there because it's not just guilt by association. Let's face it. So Nathan, I had this kind of really disillusioning thing happen, which is not so surprising, but it was to me. A lot of the people who were current living writers and thinkers who I admired happened to be on X, formerly known as Twitter, RIP. Well, I would follow them on Twitter, formerly known as, X, formerly known as Twitter. And then suddenly I would, these people would Twitter or social media, Twitter in particular, every social media has its own kind of risks that come along with it. Twitter lends itself to, you write a lot, you say a lot. It kind of became the sort of social media intellectual hangout for a while. But people would just say incredibly silly things, or they'd say very unkind things, but they would just shoot their mouth off on all sorts of subjects. You could almost see a person becoming intoxicated with his or her own voice. And it did affect my view of them. I did read their books differently Because if let's say I'm reading some book and it's talking about love of neighbor and how important that is and hospitality and that we need to practice intellectual hospitality, and I've seen them act like a total buffoon on Twitter. Yes, I mean I can't. It's the jury will disregard that remark. Well, I can't just erase it from my brain, and so it does affect their credibility in my mind. That's just an inevitable outworking, and so that's, I think, something that will hit most of us on a pretty practical level. I think a lot of us deal with that kind of.
Okay.
We've been that person. I know I've been that person on social media. So yes, there are some scattered thoughts in response to what you said.
Let's take it even a step farther down. So yeah, there's the celebrity version. Most of you are not Greta Thunberg. Most of us don't have that big of a megaphone. And yes, we do evaluate by other people by their opinions and what they produce and what they write and say and the differences between that. Let's make it personal here. So here's what I think is at stake, is that if you, as a follower of Christ, have some sense that you're a Christian because it's the truth, not just that makes you feel good, but you think it's actually true, then the way that you get there is kind of important. And the way that you handle other things that are true or false is extremely important. So if you, for example, are very vocal about your faith and about a whole lot of other conspiracy theories, it delegitimizes other people who are curious about how you handle truth and their perspective of the meaningfulness of your faith to you. So there's an odd sense here in which we want to say, yes, our Christian faith does apply to everything and has something to do with it. But if you're sharing videos that are so obviously fake and you can Google in 20 seconds and find out that they're not true, and then your next post is about how Jesus is your Lord and Savior, you've kind of neutered your ability to have a thoughtful engagement in the category of persuasive truth. So or the gossip that we share or the stories that we tell or pass on that turn out not to be true, it just seems to me there's more at stake here for the Christian, because you're representing a whole lot more than yourself and your opinion and preference. You're also, in the way that you handle all truth to some degree, or to a significant degree, I think, saying something about the legitimacy of your faith in the eyes of other people.
Yeah, and I think there's also... we're living in a time of political polarization, and when you find yourself in this kind of atmosphere, there's a tendency to look for political allies, and you look in unlikely places. So I just want to give a little background, and maybe what I think a somewhat compassionate but firm reading of what's happening when a lot of people latch on to Christianity more as a political ally than a commitment to Jesus. So let's just put it like that. Mm-hmm. I think so these are the people who, so we'll just give some typical examples. These would be people who don't really darken the doorway of a church, have no real relationship with Jesus or his people, certainly don't read their Bibles on a regular basis, certainly don't pray on a regular basis, but would they would self-identify as Christians, and they would see that as somehow connected to an older way of life here in America, part of the American heritage and so on. Mm. So I think there are a number of ways to caricature that. And indeed, I've done that in the past, but something has occurred to me recently, Nathan, and I'm going to float this by you. I'm going to get your response to it. This doesn't make it right, by the way. So this is not good when this happens. Let me be very clear about that. But I think the tendency that I see often, Nathan, is when people hear about somebody like this, they'll say, oh, right, this is somebody who thinks that we need to go back to the 1950s, to white picket fences, and traditional family values, and traditional family values is put in scare quotes, and it's said with a heavy degree of sarcasm, and they conveniently leave out all of the other stuff, like racism and different drinking fountains and all sorts of, the McCarthy era and all sorts of other horrendous trends in American life at that time. And so basically this is cast as a form of naive and morally culpable nostalgia. You've probably heard some version of that, Nathan. I mean, I hear that from time to time.
Anybody who is pro white picket fence has clearly never painted one. It's a nuisance. I just throw that in there as free advice.
There's one.
Yeah, I'm with you. On all seriousness. Okay, I'm tracking.
So sometimes, that may be the case sometimes, but actually, what I think is really taking place is not a form of nostalgia. I think a lot of us find ourselves in a time of crisis, as we are in right now. We can talk more about that in a second, what we mean by that. But just where traditional sources of authority and culture, the social cohesion and all of that are coming apart. And that clearly is happening in our culture. And that's not a controversial statement. A number of, experts, Christian and non-Christian, are, agree on that one. When you find that happening, it's often there's a general recognition that there's something very deeply wrong, but it's hard for people to put their finger precisely or really to articulate precisely what has happened. So much has been lost. What I think is actually happening is not some form of nostalgia, but I think what they're missing is a society in which you had moral consensus, and it was real moral consensus, even on some basic fundamentals of life.
Okay, so I would say...
what does it mean to be a person?
Yeah, so all right, let's take that and run with it a second, because I think that is a form of nostalgia. Yeah, it fits within the subcategory nostalgia, I think. But is it Mark Knoll who was talking about the idea that you can live in a place where the culture changes so fast that you feel like an outsider in the place that you've lived for 50 years? And so when you have really rapid cultural change, you suddenly feel like you don't belong in the neighborhood that you've been in for a long time. So there's also a sense in which it's not nostalgia, but we start sharing information because we're trying to find our people. I say our people with quotes there. Like, who is like us? Who shares our same views and ideas? Yeah. So there's a little bit of like throwing bread on the water to find out where the other fish at. There's kind of a desire there to say, how do I find who's still with me and where do I fit and belong in here?
And look at the way those, I'm calling these loosely sort of political alliances. That's in times like that, that's when you'll find Christians sometimes working together with Mormons or other groups like that, or Jewish groups, where there are fundamental disagreements, fundamental theological and eschatological disagreements, but there are some political agreements concerning the family and all of that. That's that, because it's this sort of, so much has changed, so much has just dried up, but we at least have these bonds in common, and we can work together on a policy level maybe. But I don't know, Nathan. Maybe let's go back and forth a little bit more here. I'm not so sure it's nostalgia. It's a subcategory of nostalgia, because I think C.S. Lewis's way of grouping all of this traditional way of looking as the Tao. He does this in The Abolition of Man. Do you remember that, Nathan?
Fill us in.
In Abolition of Man, he talks. Well, but basically, the Tao is what he talks about. The traditional, you could almost call it moral law theory, the traditional way of looking at human beings and the way societies flourish. Think about basic assumptions like the family is the building block of society, and that kind of thing. We have moved so far away from that. We've moved in what academics call an anti-essentialist direction, where we deny the deep-rooted essential nature of some of these categories, like a human being or a man and a woman. And this is it's hard to date it precisely, but probably the 1960s and the sexual revolution, and we've gone further even now. But I think what people are recognizing is that the social fabric is eroding because we can't agree on what human beings are for. And again, most people feel this on more of a gut level. It's not a carefully articulated thing. I think the person who really put their finger on it very well in the 1980s was Alistair McIntyre with his book After Virtue. But just the notion of, what are human beings for? How does human life actually work? Rather than trying to just dig up all of our roots and reimagine everything, which is what is happening now. I think there's a longing for that kind of those basic assumptions remained intact for many, for a long time, and now suddenly everything's up for grabs.
All right, well, let's bring it in this way. So let's set aside where the impulse comes from. Can we agree that the impulse of that is born out of a fear or some perceived crisis, an attempt to rectify or pursue some sort of ideal, and to find the other people who are also pursuing that ideal? So are we on the same page in that category? Now, here's something that I recognize.
Yes.
A couple through a number of crises that you and I have watched unfold, is that where you choose to process a crisis will show you where your true community actually is. In fact, it's one of the main indicators. If you're kind of wondering who is my community? Well, who do you talk to about stuff during a crisis? That's a pretty good indicator. Who did you hang out with during COVID? Who do you talk to at the death of a family member? When you get sick, who takes care of you? These peel back all the facade, and that shows you where your community really is. That's why I think people who don't have it are extremely vulnerable to certain online expressions and this. So I see a desire to find your group of people through a digital engagement as a serious nutrient deficiency in actual community. So if you have to resort to the internet to find somebody on the other side of the world that you think you're forming or other side of the country, for some reason that neediness to belong and then matching that with Christianity doesn't make sense in my mind. They don't fit in a political sense or a political way. So that's where I'm saying that I think some of our vulnerability to being sucked into things that promise us these pseudo-savior mentalities and narratives that are easy that have a pretty low threshold for people to jump on the bandwagon, really mess with the perception of how it is that Christians come to conclusions about truth. That's a gobbledygook way of saying that.
Well,
I'm leaning towards something here.
Sure. Well, and I think, let's just be honest. So I tried to give a compassionate reading here, but on the other side of that, I think it makes a lot of sense that outsiders increasingly see Christianity as little more than a political movement, which is tragic.
Oh, yeah. No, that's true. Yeah.
And certainly with the word you go one further, if you talk about evangelicalism, I think in the United States, by and large, that is seen as predominantly a political category, which, again, if you look at the origins of the movement, it's not what it was about. This was a spiritual movement. So, but this is based on public expressions of many, many people who self-identify as Christians.
Okay, so back to the interview with Russell Moore and Tobias. They were saying, look at, for example, an image of January 6th at the Capitol, and you have somebody with a Jesus Saves flag, and then a bunch of Wiccan imagery all around them, all championing the same thing. So there comes then an ideal that transcends the religious component of it, that the religious component just becomes your avenue into this bigger story or this bigger picture. That seems to be interesting. But what I find in myself is that, and maybe others listening do too, is what you end up with is an embarrassment, not of Christ, but of other Christians at times. And you're like, seriously, you're making us all look bad. And I'm not talking about January 6th here. That's whatever.
Sure.
But on a more local and personal level, it's like you've made a public profession of Christ, and you're also in. So you get this interesting thing happens in the New Testament where they talk about they went out from us, but they weren't part of us. Where there's a differentiation between association and actual belonging to the Christian community. And that's what we wrestle with now is we no longer, particularly, well, actually in even the old school, more institutional versions of church, we don't have a yeah, no, you're not part of us as a public statement where we can't say, well, that person's not a Christian and doesn't represent what I believe well, because they're, so you
Sure.
kind of get stuck in this, like, that person gets to speak for me without me saying whether or not I actually believe or agree with anything that they're participating in. That's where I think the interior rubber hits the road.
Yeah, that's true. Well, one important distinction to bear in mind, this is a country that is all about self-expression. But Christianity, if you are indeed a Christian, it's really, that's not about, self-expression is not the primary mode of your Christianity. It is who you are. You're a person who is born again, and now it is no longer you who live, but Christ in you. And so bumper stickers are forms of self-expression. T-shirts are forms of self-expression. Slogans are forms of self-expression. Wearing a T-shirt that says Jesus saves may be helpful up to a point. I'm inclined to think it probably isn't that helpful, but it may be. But that's also, again, it's a form of self-expression, and it's a form of consumer Christianity. So I think I would like to put out there that this is a helpful way to discern, not whether a person is a Christian or not, because let's face it, we can't see into a person's heart. Christ alone has access to a person's heart, but as a way to read behavior and learn from behavior and think about how seriously you want to weigh a person's words on their religious convictions. If they're coming to you predominantly in the form of slogans, products that are also mixed very syncretistically with other antithetical Christian symbols, then I think you've got good reason for pause for thought. You've got good reason to think Christianity is being put to some kind of use here. It's a vehicle to further some other agenda. Versus if you see somebody who is not perfect, but is committed to a way of life that is very countercultural, but beautifully countercultural in the sense that they want to help those around them. They want to bring healing. They want to love their neighbors. That's very different. There's also a word of warning to us when it comes to responding to that relentless pressure to have opinions about everything, to sound off on Israel and Palestine, to sound off on the latest mass shooting, to sound off. Here's a recent example. Maybe this isn't the best time. We've just lost the celebrity Matthew Perry, who appeared on Friends. He struggled with addiction for many years. I believe when it was in and out of rehab for 60 times or something, more than 60 times. Maybe, a day of his death, hours after his death, or the next day, that's not the time for you to sound off on the consequences of hedonism and searching for meaning in every place and not finding it in fame and fortune. I've seen a number of people do this. I get it. I think, yeah, but the timing is not great. So I'm just saying we need to use our discernment. And we have to walk by wisdom when it comes to our public comportment.
Yeah, okay, but so this is what we're not getting worked out here, is that where does the need to be heard come from other than a place of insecurity? Why it wouldn't even cross my mind to have an opinion on that. So I guess what I'm saying is what are we communicating when we participate in things like that? That's what I'm saying. Like, does my question make sense?
If we're not careful, we're falling. It does, and I think it's a good question. What are we communicating, and why? What's the motivation? I think if we're not careful, the temptation is to fall into some version of perhaps identity politics is too strong of a phrase, but speak up to provide a voice for your respective tribe. Well, here's the Christian take on this celebrity's death. Here's the Christian take on what's going on in the Middle East. Here's the Christian take. So, again, if we're not careful, those become just mere vehicles for self-expression. To give, they can become tribalistic.
Okay, yeah. So I think we're getting two things confused here. So there's self-expression, sure, but what we're talking about is the co-opting of religion as a sub-form of some. Okay, let's. Do you have a bumper sticker on your car that says, "I stand for the flag and kneel for the cross"? Have you ever seen that one? T-shirt, bumper sticker.
Of course. Yep.
Okay, what's being
I've seen it.
communicated
I
by
don't
that?
have it.
Yeah. I was kind of, I was guessing that you didn't, but what's being communicated by that? What's your guess? So respect for country and for
You tell
faith,
me.
right? Yeah. I think,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also doing it in a way. So it's not just self-expression. It's making a statement about who you are so you can engage and find other people who see the world in the same way. So you're using
Sure.
your faith to find your tribe.
It's a badge to.
But the main identity of the
Yeah.
tribe is not based on the faith. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say.
Right. Yeah. I think, there's that. I mean, we want, again, I'm not saying we don't need to have we don't want to bring Christian perspectives to bear on different issues. I'm not saying that. We should. But I am saying we need to be, we're limited, each of us, in our capacities to comment on a given subject with wisdom and insight. Necessarily so. We're just human beings. And so if that's the case, if there's something that's happened that is a big deal and is very complex and has captured national attention, there are times where we ought to sit it out and say nothing.
So,
And that's okay.
Hang on. Well, we need to point out the irony of the fact that we're saying this on a podcast where we twice a week
Of course, saying this
pontificate
on
on all
Thinking Out
sorts of
Loud.
ideas. Yeah. So we're saying this on Thinking Out Loud. I recognize that. However, you would also be amazed, listener, at the amount of things that Cameron and I choose not to talk about. So we actually aren't talking about everything that pops into our minds here on a weekly basis. And some of that is because A, we have nothing to contribute. Nobody knows what's actually going on. B, it's not respectful or helpful. There are lots of reasons to not pontificate on something. So I just want to mention that. Maybe, Cameron, you have a follow-up word of wisdom there too, because there are clearly times in which you call evil evil and you call good good, and Christians are well-equipped and informed to have opinions and analysis and insight into truth and reality in the way that everything from politics to butchering a chicken works. It's a full range of it is a full lifestyle thing. So I'm not anti the idea of Christians being involved in everything, but there are times in which it doesn't seem like we're doing that Christianly. And I see that as a tragedy for the individuals that are involved, but also as a source of disbelief for the people who are looking from the outside in, of saying, well, these people really claim to be safe and secure in this, but they're acting like they're terrified, or they really think that Jesus is Lord, but they won't be able to sleep at night unless this person gets elected as the prime minister of Great Britain. I guess all of this is an analysis for me to continuously to be evaluating myself and my motives for doing things. And I don't know that I'm good at that as an individual, and I need a community to help me, but that community is not going to be digital or online. So that's all I'm saying. Yeah.
So it's hard to summarize this all. This has been a little bit kind of haphazard, but a couple of items that might be helpful for listeners as just sort of takeaways here. There's on the one hand, the necessity, as Nathan has pointed out, of a proper, thick community. Not an online community, but the people around you, the people immediately in your life. And ideally speaking, your church will be a big part of that. And this community are part of how we process reality. We can't figure it all out ourselves. America is fiercely individualistic, has always been, and that tendency gets expressed in a fetish for, conspiracy theories and all sorts of ways of trying to figure everything out ourselves because we distrust the government, we distrust other organizations. But the truth is we need each other. So having a healthy, flourishing community around you of people with whom you can process. I think also of vital significance here is being able to honor the distinction between private and public communication. So processing stuff and talking about stuff, speaking off the cuff about things that you don't have any expertise on is totally fine and necessary. We have to do that. We're going to talk to each other. But context is important. Doing it in a place where it's public, so publishing it for the world on social media or somewhere else where it's an area where you really don't have that much understanding, you don't have that much insight to offer, think twice about that. Nathan and I are careful. We don't always get it right. We try to be careful here on Thinking Out Loud, but the context of this matters immensely because this is a podcast. A number of people listen. And so we do try to bring a certain level of refinement to whatever we talk about on here. And if it's a news item that we just can't get our heads around, we're not going to talk about it. And that's an important thing to do. And there are probably, so honoring that public-private distinction. And then finally, paying attention to the ways in which Christianity gets co-opted into something else, either whether it's conflated with one's U.S. citizenship or one's political alliances. This is something that's a deep, normal temptation. It's been a temptation down the ages. If you look at church history, you'll see repeated examples of this. This happens a lot, and not just with Christianity. If you look at any history of a state religion, look at Hinduism in India right now, for instance. You're going to find that temptation and that danger. And the real danger there is that Christianity gets completely misrepresented and that those outside the church, get a very jaded picture of what Christianity is all about. And we need to be aware of that because that's a big feature of the American religious landscape. And especially as we have election season coming up, this is just something to keep on your radar. So I think those 3 takeaways are kind of a helpful way to, I hope it's a helpful way to get your head around this conversation.
That is good. Let me tell a real quick story as a way to summarize, I think, what you were saying there. So some of you be familiar with the idea of, like, is it see you at the poll or meet you at the poll where there's this movement for prayer at the flagpole by a school. I don't have the right. And so it was something that I always kind of kept an eye on when I was a student. And so it happened this year, and my daughter, who is 10, came home and said, "Oh, this happened today." And I said, "Yeah, what'd you think of that?" And she said, "I don't know how to feel about that, Dad." She said, "A, we were gathered at a flagpole, and the person who was praying probably doesn't pray much in real life, and it wasn't clear who she was praying to, and it sort of seemed like the point of the prayer was that she was praying, not that she was actually asking anything." And I was like, oh, snap. Like, that's a pretty good analysis of, is our public expression of our faith clear? Is it focused on the right things? Is it winsome and wholesome and done out of a repetition of what our character actually is? Or are we just trying to force that as an additional label onto a larger agenda at some point? So I'm not poo-pooing that whole moment. I just thought it was interesting that you could have a 10-year-old who could get that feel for there's something not quite authentic about this. And if a 10-year-old can pick up on that, you can be sure that everybody else can as well. So let's keep these things in the back of our mind and make sure that our public expressions of our faith come from the proper motivation of wanting to love God and love our neighbors and serve the Lord well and serve our world well, and that they really reflect the peace that Christ has granted to us as his followers. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.